this webinar on COVID-19 and the food crisis, solidarity buying, food pantries, and local supply networks. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Vishwas Satgar. I'm an academic at Wits University, but I'm wearing two other hats this afternoon. I'm the board chairperson of the Cooperative and Policy Alternatives Center. It's a grassroots NGO come think tank that's been around for about 21 years in South Africa. It's done a lot of work on democratic systemic alternatives, ranging from cooperatives to sustainable local manufacturing, eco-village work, and of course, working on solidarity economy. And a few years ago, co-founded the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign. Now that's the other hat I'm wearing. The South African Food Sovereignty Campaign has been around for about 6 years, and we kicked off our work in the midst of the drought, and particularly with a hunger tribunal in 2016, with the Human Rights Commission, to really kind of put a human face and voice to the challenge South Africa has had even before COVID-19. Now, the food crisis is emerging very sharply on the ground. We have on the one hand an attempt to mitigate a public health challenge, unprecedented for us, uncharted for all of us. But at the same time, there's the challenge of the balance of mitigating sort of the socio-economic impacts. And it would seem that food is looming large as a major problem on the ground right now. Now, to help us kind of work through this issue and kind of gain a perspective on what's happening, we have a great lineup of panelists. And I must apologize up front. Susanna Coleman is having a few technical difficulties kind of plugging into the panel, but we're hoping that she'll be able to join us. We have with us Tatjana von Bormann, and her little bio together with everybody else's has been shared with all of you. But I'll just highlight a few things. Tatjana is a sort of food systems expert and a futurist working at WWF. And she's done some work on food scenarios for South Africa. And actually, I think that's where we met. And obviously bumped heads as well. But it's really great to have Tatjana on board. We also have Dorah Marema. Dorah's a board member of COPAC, but she's been a long-standing environmental justice activist in South Africa. Her pioneering work around the Greenhouse Project is very notable for many of us as activists and inspiring. She's also leading a Southern Africa network, Gender CC, around climate justice issues. So welcome to both of you. The way this is going to flow today and this afternoon is we're going to really sort of run it as a conversation. We sort of explore particular themes around this area, and then I'll kind of invite you in to contribute. I must also say that there's room for our audience to also participate. And I suppose as the panel exhausts the discussion, we'll open it up for Q&A at that point. So for those of you who are participating, please note your questions and things like that. Now, South Africa went into this lockdown with about 14 million people going to bed hungry. You know, household surveys in South Africa also over the years have been giving different numbers about the amount of hungry people. But the lockdown also impacted on the food commons, which is a big part of food provisioning in our society. And here I'm not just talking about the 180,000 small-scale farmers in South Africa. Here I'm talking about small-scale gardeners in communities. I'm talking about micro farmers. I'm talking about fisher folk as well. Thousands of them around our coastal cities and areas that feed their families. So the lockdown has locked down the food commons as well. It's impacted on informal traders that are also part of these distribution and supply networks into communities. We also have a situation where schools, I mean, 9 million children in South Africa depend on the hot meal they receive in school feeding programs. We also are seeing, if you like, an immediate shutdown on the livelihoods of people in the informal economy, almost 4 million of them, 1 million being domestic workers, reclaimers between 60,000 to 90,000 and so on. So there's a dramatic set of dynamics on the ground, people living from hand to mouth, living from day to day, suddenly faced with the situation of not being able to even get out onto the streets and eke out a living. So I'm going to throw this back to you. Maybe Dorah, you might want to kind of come in and just give us a perspective from your location and where you are situated around what's happening.
So yeah, definitely I agree with you, Vish, that we are really facing unprecedented times. COVID-19 came at a time when, many of us were not prepared for it. And I think our communities even more. And I think you also highlighted that a lot of our food commons have also been locked down with the lockdown, and obviously pushing many of our people to very desperate situations. I think I can safely say that a lot of our people are really on a knife's edge. What you have seen yesterday and the other day, where there were, people burning stores and vandalizing and doing all those kind of things, has been something that we've been witnessing in the past few days. Very, very desperate times, especially in many informal settlements and townships, but also with the middle class, right? I read a comment on our Green Business College Facebook the other day, this week, because we run a project called Ubuntu. And people were asking what kind of people qualify to be able to get food during this time. And someone was saying, I am not an elderly. I am not what could be classified as someone who's vulnerable during this time. But even I and my family needs to eat, because basically I haven't earned anything for the past 4 weeks or something like that. Because you do have people also who work and they get paid fortnightly, and they are not your normal groupings that we would regard as being vulnerable when we go into these areas and looking to identify to support. And I think the situation is very dire, but I think is that it's something that we can take and ponder on, because I've been saying to people, this is not new. So this virus is really just exposing the inequalities, the desperation, the dire situation that our people live in. And almost kind of forgotten, because there are so many issues that we are juggling, that we are dealing with as civil society. And I think it's something that can easily be repeated. If we do not learn from it right now, we can easily, go back to business as usual, and continue with our usual programming, responding to the donor requirements, and not necessarily learn from this and actually go back and transform the way that we have been doing things. It is really critical that we take a moment to learn from this moment, and actually go back after the lockdown and intensify the massive work of collaboration that has been started as a result of this.
Thank you, Dorah. Tatjana, from your location and positioning, what are you seeing and unfolding on the ground?
Thanks, Vish. And I think I need to give a little context. I mean, WWF is an environmental NGO and might be seen to be actually outside of the frame of this conversation. But because of the massive extent of this, because our efforts to stay off a health crisis has led us into incredibly deep and long-lasting economic crisis. There is, as both you and Dorah say, there's no dimension of society that is untouched by this. And in addition to the food conversation we'll have today, we've seen at WWF absolutely in our plastics program, the waste workers, the reclaimers, who are in many towns continuing to work and are absolutely unprotected in terms of exposure to disease, and have no ability to get access to those kind of that kind of protective gear. Mine affected communities. These are both communities that we were working with in terms of building resilience in a sort of post-mine environment or economic situation within that town. And they are now they are now having to deal with the flood of miners back into their towns without any testing. And so the anxiety in these already hungry, already vulnerable communities as the numbers swell. So that's been another area where we've had to reshift our thinking and get engaged. And I think one that also deserves mentioning here is the wildlife economy. So as much as we all now understand something about wet markets and about the dangers of wild meat consumption and potentially the root of the disease is coming out of wet markets, the wildlife economy has been absolutely shut down. So all our protected areas, all our tourism sites in South Africa are no longer generating revenue. The communities and people who relied on those for income can no longer be sure that they will get paid. And so that has also been for us an area for many governments certainly, and for many, another area of deep concern. And then in the food work, WWF works across the food system in both the production and the consumption side. And certainly we have seen just how significant the vulnerabilities in the informal market are, and the small scale fishers and small scale farmers. We sit with this strange duality in South Africa of just short of 30,000 commercial farmers providing the majority of food into the formal market, but then something in the range of 2 million small scale or subsistence farmers and fishers who depend on their ability to grow food and in some cases access market in order to survive. So deep vulnerabilities on that side, and then as Dorah said, from an ability to access food, afford food, and purvey food, for the informal market, to actually sell food. All those things have become what was once, not a perfect system by any means, deep rifts and deep problems in the system, but there was a certain degree of functioning that was wiped out overnight.
So, Angie Macheka said before the lockdown, the people have their coping mechanisms. And maybe she was referring to the food commons on the ground, but they actually locked that down, which is quite perverse. And it is having very deleterious negative impacts on the lives of people. So I think this is a big part of the challenge. I mean, this lockdown has been approached with a complete lack of understanding of alternative food economies, food practices, food systems that are central to the reproduction of our communities and so on. And I think for me, this is what's showing itself. At the same time, I think Dorah's point that this is not new. I mean, the food crisis has been in this society. This is one of the most unequal societies in the world. I mean, in rural communities, farm worker-based communities, ironically, those who also produce our food on farms are also suffering immensely. They've been suffering even before this because of low wages, exploitation, etc. So anyway, I think all these fault lines, all these dynamics are really coming together and are feeding into the food crisis at the moment. I want to shift the focus a little bit to the state response to this. Now, just from a rough calculation, I mean, if you think about it, 18 million people on social grants in South Africa, and even the highest grants, for the old age and those that are disabled, about 1,800, is not enough to sustain a household of 4 people in South Africa. I mean, work that has been done by PACSA and others tracing staples and costs says you require at least a minimum of 2,500 to meet your staple needs. So you have that. You have the informal economy shut down, so almost 4 million people. You have structural unemployment, which has already been big in the society, probably going to jump to about 9 million from about 5.6 million. So you're looking at a big problem here of about 30 million people that require food right now in this country, that are in a state of desperation. Now, the government has leaned on the supermarket supply chains and on the Solidarity Fund and on its social development programs. Are there any perspectives around what's happening, particularly around the Solidarity Fund? Because it seems supermarkets are putting money into that. It would seem that The public is invited to make donations, etc. And that seems to be the channel through which you want to meet the food needs of 30 million people. Are there any perspectives on this and what's wrong with the government's response?
I can go first, Vish. I think this is a challenge. We are trying, the government is trying to solve this problem or this challenge with the same mindset that created things like this in the first place. The whole notion of centralizing services and centralizing all kinds of responses towards this COVID-19. And I actually spoke to another colleague of mine in the development sector, and they were sharing with me that they had been asked by a government to put funds within the Solidarity Fund. I said, don't do it. Don't put funds there. They have been sitting with the funds. We are nearly at the end of the lockdown, which has been extended. And we am yet to meet someone that says to me, I have received funds from the Solidarity Fund to do the work that we are doing. What you see people doing out there, what you see us doing, it's from ourselves, it's from the pockets of the people, it's from the very communities by giving their own time, labor, and resources to feeding the others that are vulnerable within their own communities. Very little is coming from government. And I think when the lockdown happened, and you've seen farmers not being able to access their gardens, you've seen schools not being open because there's spinach in there that can feed the neighborhood, that can feed the street. They can go harvest already. The people who are in charge of that project can sell the money, have money to buy meal, but they've got spinach that they can use in their own homes, but also distribute. Why should we be waiting for a truckload of things to be coming from somewhere to come and bring resources within the community? Meanwhile, within the community itself, we have been working with small producers who were, before the lockdown, were sitting with the produce that they needed to sell, for them to be able to generate income to feed their own families. But if government was already thinking about the localized, decentralized solutions towards this, then I don't think you'll be seeing the riots that are there. You wouldn't see the waste speakers immediately going back to the street, because guess what? Why do you lock them down? Because the waste is still being even generated, maybe even more, because everyone is now stuck at home. They are not traveling. There's lots of things that have been generated. These guys are surviving from these things, and they need to be, at least they may not be selling, but they would like to be able to continue harvesting and putting it aside so that when the lockdown ends, they can be selling. So you respond with a very, top-down hierarchy way of doing things, which is not helping. And then the resources also are being pulled into one source, and that source is not reaching the people. It has never happened in the past where government has been efficient and effective with responding to things like this. And I don't understand why, why we think something else will happen. I kept on saying to people, let's look at ourselves, because for the first week, we spent a lot of time filling in forms, sending names, sending databases to the Solidarity Fund, and we've never had anybody saying to us, I have received this much. And just on Sunday, there was an email that was making rounds where probably there was a meeting between government, the Solidarity Fund, and others. I don't know who was represented there. And they came back and said, well, tell us, what have you received from Solidarity Fund? We have to, we will be following up on Tuesday to understand what's going on. But I haven't heard anything, and I would like to hear somebody in this group in attendance of this meeting if they have been able to receive anything. But this is not something that should surprise us. This is expected.
Sorry, Tatjana, maybe you want to come in on this.
Thanks, Vish. It looks like you wanted to make a response.
No. I'll come back.
Oh, all right. Okay. Yes, I mean, Dorah's absolutely right. I cannot give an example. I only know that they are oversubscribed by many times, in terms of what they have and in the applications they've received. And I imagine that they completely underestimated the time, effort, and expertise required to go through those applications and to quickly move money through the system. So I do think there's a logjam there, and it's and we need to be looking elsewhere for immediate solutions. I think some of the things government has done extremely well is in setting an example. You know, we look to the most public figures in the land to show us how to behave, and I think that our president has done that, and done that extremely well. And not everybody, but certainly our president has led the way in demonstrating appropriate behavior and commitment to immediate action to protect the vulnerable from the disease. I think that the reality is that this was a failed system to start with. The food system was, the evidence of the failure was in multiple forms, but absolutely in the form of rising rates of stunting, rising rates of hunger, rising rates of obesity. And everybody had a part to play in that. You know, government was guilty, but there were many failures along the way, which means that in a situation like this now, it requires a collective response. I know we've all been frustrated with engaging with government, but I tell you, coming out of COVID-19, none of us are going to look to government to solve things anymore. We know now that it's each one of us. It's each one of us paying attention, reaching out, acting. You know, even if sometimes those actions aren't immediately the right ones or have consequences you didn't expect. I think there is this top-down approach, as Dorah says. We can't wait for that. We need a multi-sectoral, multi-level, multi-participant. It's why the voices of, it's why, you know, COPAC and the things you've been pushing for so long, the time has come, you know, for a much stronger voice out of the grassroots community action and participation, because that's where we have to look to build resilience.
Yeah, I mean, you know, you would have thought the government kind of set up this parallel structure, knowing the limits of the state. But as Dorah said, you know, it continued a sort of top-down, centralized kind of rationality and approach. And there's a whole set of knots and blockages there. And, you know, over almost 3 weeks into this lockdown, and it is not delivering anything to the people on the ground. This raises questions also about how this process should be democratized. The Solidarity Fund, particularly its work around food, should certainly be about a participatory approach. It should be working with communities and community-based networks. I'm just going to throw that out to enable the rapid, if you like, flow of food. It should be also working, I would argue, with the military, with the police, the Navy, the Defense Force, whatever. All of them, they have command structures, they have capabilities, they have logistical capacities, etc., to be moving food across this country wherever it's needed. Now that hasn't even clicked into place. But I think most importantly, the Solidarity Fund, I mean, the parcel-based approach to handling this problem, which is fine, it's an immediate relief measure, absolutely necessary. But it has to be complemented with opening up the food commons again. It has to be about getting small-scale gardeners, micro farmers, fisher folk, etc., back, if you like, into everyday life. If that's not going to happen, the crisis is also going to continue, I would argue. But I want to move on from there to look at the role of supermarkets. So the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign, which has been very hostile to supermarkets historically, and Tatjana knows this. But you know, we kind of assessed the situation, and early on when the regulations were falling into place, and kind of thinking, if you like, with the government around where it's prioritizing food supply and food distribution, and clearly the supermarkets, the value chains that are there, were given a priority space. And of course, in the context of a very dangerous situation where everybody is susceptible to this pandemic and so on. And so we made the case first for people's pantries, so that when consumers walk through the door of a supermarket, they be given an option to buy a solidarity basket or product or goods or whatever that could be placed in the people's pantry as a solidarity donation. And that in turn, could be then, which is the second part of the proposal, distributed to communities through the police, through the defense force, etc. So entrenching their peacekeeping role, for instance. And the third part of this was for it to be monitored with faith-based leaders and community leaders and so on. But crucial in all of this also was ethical pricing, okay? And we kept it loosely worded as ethical pricing of essentials, so that we were really trying to appeal to the conscience of these profit-making machines, okay? But there is price creep happening. Many people across the country we've been talking to and working with are reporting an escalation in prices, etc. I'm going to bring Tatjana in first here because she's really has a lot of expertise on supermarkets, and we've been engaging with her and working on trying to get this proposal forward to supermarkets. Tatjana, your thoughts on where the supermarkets are and what's happening?
So Fish, I'll give a general comment. There's obviously different behavior or different actions within each supermarket. There are some commonalities, and maybe I'll speak to that sort of on a high level. Most supermarkets have looked at ways of both allowing for customers to buy products that can be donated to their immediate communities, and that seems, according to most of the supermarkets, where most interest is coming from. People want to be able to be sure that that food is going to feed people in their town or neighborhood. And so there is a fair amount of that. And then there's the larger initiatives around channeling funds or surplus food donations into either something like Gift of the Givers. Gift of the Givers has a massive network, was capable of immediately springing into action to start ensuring food aid and food parcels in this time of rescue. And the other area where an organization whose time really has come, although it was a well-capacitated operating organization prior to this, is Food Forward. So that's the old Food Bank of South Africa. They also already had existing relationships with many of the supermarkets, and they now have geared up quite substantially and are looking, in fact, for a cash injection to start getting food off farms and really establish at a at micro hub levels almost these flows of food. There have also been some really interesting innovations, I think, in the supermarkets. The ShopRite Checkers voucher, where you can buy on your cell phone a food voucher for somebody and send it to them, which can then be redeemed at USave or ShopRite or Checkers. I mean, there are these sort of micro adjustments that allow you to donate at the till, and then that money goes into the larger funds. The Consumer Goods Council of South Africa, which is the industry body for food businesses or for fast-moving consumer goods companies, they have certainly encouraged people to work within Department of Social Development to channel funds that way, or to look at these bigger overarching programs. And I think there's quite significant onus on supermarkets to be really demonstrating that they're coming to the party in a big way, because whilst everybody else has had their doors shut and their income streams dramatically curtailed, what we've seen in the beginning of this lockdown period, it's improving now as the regulations to allow informal markets to operate again come back into play. But what we've seen is sort of this massive channeling of existing business into the formal retail space, because there was no other way of accessing food. So I think that the actions that are coming out of the retailers are commendable, but I think there is good reason for us all to be watching that and calling for ongoing evidence of support into their communities. And as I say, lots of other level food donations and funding donations, but that's kind of the big picture.
Thank you. I'm going to bring in Susanna here. Susanna, I'm glad you joined us. You might want to put your visual on. Yay. Susanna from PHA. Thank you. Susanna, do you want to just say something about what's happening with engagements with supermarkets and stuff on the ground to try and get them to have sort of donation programs and so on in place, in particularly the Western Cape area and Cape Town? We can't hear you. How do we get Susanna in?
There we go, the unmute button. Okay. If I'm patchy, I'll turn off the video.
Okay.
Can you, so let me know if I must turn off the video, because I might be patchy.
We can hear you. We can hear you and you can see you. Go for it.
Thank you, Vish. Our engagement with the supermarkets has been limited so far. So probably ask me a little later when we talk a bit more about food supply from in a bulk way. So I can't really comment on the supermarkets at the moment. Sorry about that. But we have engaged with Food Share and we are getting donations from Food Share.
Okay. Dorah, do you have any comments on this issue around supermarkets and just the existing value chain?
Yeah, I think for me, I think I hear that we should be commending supermarkets for some of the changes that they have made. But I have a challenge. I have a challenge with supermarkets in general. You have franchises and you've got owners who continue to do whatever they like. They don't treat their workers well sometimes. So I just have a challenge. But I think as part of the solution now, during the COVID-19, I understand that, you guys must also understand that we have another added challenge. We have got another added challenge of people who are not South Africans. Some of them, they don't even have IDs. And are you able to go in and get this voucher and be able to cash it? And, all of these other exclusionary measures that are there that would continue to block a lot of people, as we know that we have a lot of people who are not South Africans, and many of them who don't have ID books, and what are supermarkets going to do about those kind of people? If we are using them as a vehicle, or if they want to become part of a solution, I think it's very important that they must become really inclusive. We have seen, obviously, what you highlighted about the prices being inflated is disgusting. I don't even want to go close to even unpacking some of these things. So I think it's important that we also call out the supermarkets in some of these issues that are not sitting well with many of us. We definitely would like to commend those owners who are really proactive and really wanting to become part of the solution. But we've got a large contingent of them that are still, not putting the interest of the people first.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate because we have a problem that's big. The number we were throwing around was 30 million people that require food right now in South Africa. So, everybody needs to come to this challenge. And it's clear, people, and there's some comments coming through, like ShopRite has a voucher program. And clearly, again, there's a question of IDs, it's exclusionary, it's possibly xenophobic, et cetera, et cetera. There's a question of the urban-rural divide. And, supermarkets don't have such a deep footprint into rural communities, et cetera. So, but nonetheless, I think it's important. It's part of the debate. It's part of the kind of challenge, if you like, and the solution that we need to be reaching for. We need all resources, all capacities, all, if you like, food actors in the food system, to use the language, to play their part. I want to move on now to sort of local networks that have really sort of clicked into action. And I know Dorah and Susanna, y'all have been at the front line of trying to kind of reorganize your networks, repurpose, reposition, and so on. So maybe you should kick off. Dorah, maybe you want to say something about what you've been doing, and then we can move on to Susanna.
I think for us, we saw an opportunity, and it came out of the need of the local producers, like I indicated before, who were sitting with the produce. And on the other hand, within the same communities, you have people who go into bed without food. And why not match the two? Why not, really just, it's not even a question of someone coming from outside, because there are all of these informal things that are going on into these communities. I think it's the time for the small scale producers, the small scale farmers to actually shine, and they have been shining. They have really put their best foot forward, really showcasing us that indeed small scale producers can really feed the world. We don't expect them to be shipping food from Orange Farm to Alexandra, but just within Orange Farm, we've got enough of these small communal gardens and amazing people who are doing so great using agroecology, permaculture, really producing nutritious food, who don't have to charge so much, for their produce, and to make billions in a day, really just wanting to live and to survive, ready to pull together with others. So if they don't have what is required, they're able to call on their friends who are also growing, pull together, put packages together, and those get sold so that they too can generate money and then get distributed within the area. So what we are doing is not only just looking at feeding people, we also started to integrate seedlings and seeds and compost, and really making it fun for the neighbors to teach each other, or to learn with each other how to grow, and also because they've seen their next door neighbor who has a purpose supplying this initiative in big boxes. They want to do that the same. They too want to be able to participate. So they join in, they start learning on how to grow themselves, so that at the end of this, you have people in one area or in many of these areas able to produce their own food and supplying to one another. And then you will end up with surpluses, where we could even think about solidarity markets in these areas. Where they could come together once a month on a Saturday, knowing that everybody bring their thing. Doesn't have to be food related, it can be crafts, it can be anything. But what you're also starting to do in there, there's social cohesion that happens. People are no longer looking each other through the fence. They're starting to interact with one another, knowing that if I need something sewn, I can go to that house number what, or that, that house over there and get it sorted by that guy. And if I need, if I need millies, I can go to that place. So you already start to see that, instead of only looking at, bringing in solutions from outside that will leave at the end of the COVID-19 and leave the communities more like even worse than they were before, because we would have created this culture of dependence, giving people stuff that we cannot sustain.
Thank you. Susanna?
Thanks, Vish. Thanks, Gloria. Well, certainly it's not sustainable to keep giving people food. But at the same time, people are locked up at home and they are starving. So if we come straight to my setting, where we're living in a farmlands with about 9,000 people without work at the moment, we've decided to provide food packs, about 25 kilogram food packs, which is designed to provide a family of 4 for a week. We're going guns delivering those at the moment. We sidestepped the supermarkets. We understood much better after engaging with them that the logistical challenges, somebody like Pick n Pay has been set up logistically, and they run a certain way, and they cannot deviate from that under in a very short space of time. It's taken them years to establish those logistics. The other one was a principle that we don't want to get food from the supermarkets, because that just boosts the shareholder price. And in fact, what the supermarkets should do, from the PHA campaign's opinion, is give us money, because we taking exactly every rand that people are giving us and handing it over in food into people's hands. And so we're lucky in this farming community. We are engaged with every single one of the 10 informal settlements. 2 of them are quite intimidating. They are large, they have gang leaders, they are divided up into cliques. But what we did was we started with the small settlements. We started with a survey form. It's all being done by the communities themselves. They've set up the logistics themselves, and we've been able to deliver 600 food parcels so far. Our first round is 1,800 food parcels. That's the number of families. So by the end of next week, we will have delivered the 1,800 parcels. And if we can carry on raising money, we want to be able to spend that money on the cheapest buy possible. And of course, we're involved with the same sort of work that Gloria is doing, the long-term vision of people being able to provide themselves with food. We're in a slightly different setting in the Western Cape, where nobody has been given land. There really aren't enough people growing enough food. People hundreds of people have done permaculture courses, but they are trying to grow on a scrap of yard in the township. And there's really no large-scale redistribution of land. I must say that when we come up to Gauteng, we're really jealous of the people who are able to lease, just straightforward, go to the municipality, lease a piece of land. That doesn't exist in the Western Cape. And so the long-term vision would be beautiful. I think this is an amazing opportunity for us to switch systems, but the short-term need is what we have to keep our eyes on the ball. And we're trying to do what we're good at. We have good relationships in communities. The communities are getting much better organized. It's fantastic. The growth curve that I've been on, I've become a magnificent retailer in the last 2 weeks. And I can shop for 2 days and come away with an amazing amount of food for literally hundreds of families. And that's the value at the moment, because we mustn't lose sight of the fact that we are focusing on keeping people at home. Yeah. And really the only way you're going to keep people at home is to provide food. We're quite worried about the extent to which the Western Cape government, I saw a question earlier, the Western Cape government has given money to about 8,000 NGOs, but the price, they're charging 2,000 Rand for a food pack that we're delivering for 500 Rand. And that sort of thing, where you have the blue tenderpreneur angle of just reworking the system so that your friends, jobs for pals. And that's really concerning. We can't do that much about it at the moment. What we say as a campaign is, we'll do our best to refine our system. There are plenty of CANs, community action networks in Cape Town, who are partnering with different areas. So Newlands is partnering with Brown's Farm. Different areas are in the suburbs are partnering with the townships. And those relationships are developing and getting better all the time. And I think that we're probably doing as much as we can without any money. There should be much more money coming our way.
Can I just have a follow-up question, maybe before even bringing Tatjana in? So how do you identify where the need is in a particular area and community? Are you working with the CANs or local organizations? I mean, how is that all kind of fitting together at the moment?
So, thanks for that, Vish. We live in a rural area. It's 3,000 hectares of farmland in the middle of Cape Town. It's our community. The PHA campaign has been working here for 10 years. We don't need to develop relationships, and that's how we were able to hit the ground running almost immediately, is that we could say we're going to buy food today, and tomorrow the community will have sorted themselves out. The question was just to line up what the principle would be. We've decided we're delivering 1 food pack per household. When we know that the employment rate is so low here. Only 30% of the informal settlements are employed, and only half of that are farm workers. So those farm workers are now assuming the needs of so many more people at once, that each household is really desperate in and of itself. So there are no exclusion criteria for the first round. Once we have the community survey form, it may be that we have to start rationing it on the second and third round, especially as people get unlocked and the piecemeal workers can go back to work. I myself at the moment am completely unemployed and unsalaried. So there's plenty of people as the lockdown softens who will start to go back to work, and then we can spend our money perhaps a bit more efficiently. The suggestion has been then that we would be able to say to communities, for every 10 of you, we'll give you 7 packs. You guys decide. And I think that that's one of the elements that we really must keep in front of our minds, is that communities know how to organize themselves. They know themselves. They know what the priorities are. And the other element that has been fascinating is that in the areas where we haven't been able to fill in the survey forms, because we need the survey forms for numbers. And we're basically saying, in exchange for a food pack, we'll get a survey form in return. We couldn't get them filled in when we asked them, the predominantly male informal settlement committees, to fill them in. And then we started moving to the women and the health committee people. Within a day, the all the forms were filled in, and the next day we were able to deliver food. So yeah, put women in charge of the food supply, and then put people who have relationships with those women in charge of finding the food and delivering it to them, and that'll work.
Excellent. Dorah, just on this question, I mean, how have you all been identifying households or communities to intervene?
We definitely just go in. So our point of entry is the small producers. And so we work with them to find out how much and who is also there in their area, who's producing, meaning just to get the size of the food that we can get, and if there's anything that needs to be brought in. But we try as much as possible to get the people to tell us how much they've got. And then we say to them, because this is your community, could you be able to let us know which of the areas are the most are the ones that are really, really very vulnerable, and it's very urgent that we get there with some food. So they identify and they give us the list, and we start to calculate plus minus in those areas. So there are community champions. There are people that they've been there, they work with. So they work together to identify the households that are really desperate during this time. Sometimes it's just an old man living by himself. Sometimes it's a family child-headed household. So for us, it's very important to know who's receiving the food, because we know that even gender inequality is such a big problem in our society in general. And if we are not careful, we may bring in solutions that might end up perpetuating some of these challenges that are already faced within these communities. So we are also documenting. So the farmers, as they go in, working with the community champions to deliver the food to the targeted household, they are also documenting who are these families and how old is someone, and do they have a relative or some form of support. They assist them to plant a backyard garden or container garden. So the database is going to serve several purposes, one of whom is that they will have to keep in touch with these families from this point going forward, to support them, to check how the gardens are doing, what are some of the other needs. And what we just came up with just yesterday is to mobilize some bodies within these communities who then assist in picking the food for the next round. That we don't want to incur any more costs, that all the money that we get go straight to buying the food from the producers and straight into the families, and there are no other costs of transport and other costs of labor. That we work with the people within those families or those communities to be able to assist in picking the food for the next delivery.
I think the point about women carrying the burden of reproduction in our society is a very important one. And even in our own campaigning over the years, we picked up that, women have been skipping meals, they've been rationing food, they've been borrowing food in communities to keep their families going. And it's clearly a challenge even now under COVID-19. And if you like, the feminization of hunger under COVID-19. Tatjana, I don't know if there's anything you want to share about local networks and stuff from where you are located that might be kicking
Thanks,
in.
Vish. Maybe just some points that have come up in the comments being made. I mean, I think Susanna makes an incredibly important point about, the need for immediate rescue or food aid, but needing at the same time to think about long-term resilience. And I think one of the, Dorah made the point right up front, we need to learn from this, and we need to establish now the things we can put in place to change and improve things. And I think this idea of shorter value chains, where we're now establishing relationships directly between the horse and carriage, thanks, Susanna, between the small-scale farmer and the family, the box scheme buyer, or whatever it is. Those are so critical, and keeping those running post this lockdown period needs to be one of the positive outcomes of this, that we shorten value chains and create producer-consumer direct relationships. So just that point. And then just a point on this issue of fresh gardens. I mean, one of the things that's happened here, I keep getting too much sun, not enough sun, one of the things that has happened here in the supply of food aid is a rapid decline in dietary diversity. So certainly the government food parcels have no fresh food in them. They are all shelf stable, carbohydrate heavy, processed foods, because of the need to, you don't know when those will be eaten. They need to last a long time. They're possibly going into homes without any proper storage. Some of them even will be homes where there's no ability to cook them, so there has to be things that can be instantly prepared. And that's a real concern. That's a concern because it's a feedback loop into the already unhealthy diets of the poor, with high rates of non-communicable diseases. And now you're further worsening that diet and potentially entrenching behavior where it didn't exist before for coming out of COVID-19. So how do we make sure that fresh fruit and vegetables, fresh meat and fish, whatever is able to get to those homes, is a big concern in the long term. Obviously now we just have to make sure people are not starving, but the role of the smallholder in getting fresh produce into vulnerable communities is really critical. And just as an aside, there was this a weird somehow oversight by government when they announced the lockdown, that seeds were seen as non-essential. So nobody could get access to seeds, not smallholders, not homes, not people with a lot who wanted to grow. And now that's been changed, but it's been very slow to filter down into the various seed purveyors. So, there are these things that didn't get thought through that should have been important, immediate ways of creating interest and commitment and processes to support food gardens that didn't happen. So I think that is something we all need to continue to push for, this understanding of where our food comes from and why we all have a role in not just going to the supermarket, but actually understanding who grows in my area, what do I grow, have I got access to a place to grow? And then on the final point of how do you work out who's hungry, and how do you do that in a time when it's safest for everybody to stay home? That has been a big challenge in the work we're doing. And I know that both UCT and Stellenbosch have had to, from an ethics perspective, completely revamp their approach to research, because you cannot expose people to risk, already vulnerable people to risk, in your effort to do something good for them. And that's an ongoing process, trying to learn how to understand who is hungry, who has access to power in their house, who has access to storage, who has access to refrigeration, what kind of food do they require, how many are there. That is an ongoing challenge, and I think requires a lot of collective minds to bring the most effective solution to solving it.
So there's a great sort of theme that's come out here, which provides a bridge to the final kind of issue I want to interrogate and explore with all of you. And that's the question of the next food economy. The issue of using this moment, and all of you in different ways have been speaking to it. I mean, Dorah, in your work, kind of getting the seeds out and sort of networking knowledge to set up gardens, etc. Susanna, the PHA being an anchor and a sort of flagship kind of small scale farming operation, kind of being the backbone at this moment. And again, providing people with a very important point of reference of what's important in the moment of crisis and beyond. And Tatjana, you raised it sharply. So the next food economy, you're saying decentralize, sort of short circuit it directly from farmer to household, or directly from farmer to consumer. I think the other issue here that's coming out is localizing this, localizing it as much as possible in communities, in villages, in towns and cities. If you like, this has been our mantra in the food sovereignty campaign, like build these pathways, which links to the next big theme, which is what is the role of citizens and communities now around this food crisis? Can they play this part in a way that is safe, that is ethical, safe to them, safe to their communities, their families, etc., to ensure food production? There's definitely space here for household food production. The problem we have is going to last a long time until we have a vaccine, and that's probably over a year from now. We probably have graduated release of the lockdown, etc., but we're going to be operating and living and surviving in very difficult conditions. So localizing food production in communities, in households is one issue. The other is, of course, I mean, both Dorah and Susanna have been able to kind of, jump the regulatory hurdles. You all have been able to find space to operate. Now, this is not the case across the board in every part of the country. I mean, many small-scale food producers, small-scale gardeners, small-scale farmers are struggling to kind of find their space. So can you all share your thoughts around how we increasingly bring in citizens and communities to localize, to build food sovereignty pathways? Who wants to go? Dorah, do you want to go first?
I mean, we have been inundated for the Ubuntu project with a lot of questions from, citizens in those particular areas. I think it's important that everybody plays a role, as you say. If we're talking to the small producers, we're talking to the people who are sitting at home that are unemployed, who could provide that labor, that we need to be able to pack the food and to deliver it in the households around the area because they know them best. To the people who are, I can't say they are affluent, but they may not be living in Orange Farm, staying in Johannesburg, but they've got a home in Orange Farm. And I was humbled by one guy that called, who saw right at the beginning of that campaign that we started, saw it on Facebook and contacted and said, I recognize that young man in the picture who's carrying a box, who's delivering. He's from my street, and I would like to buy for myself in Sandton and buy for the whole street because I trust him, right? So for me, those are the stories behind this. It's communities doing it for themselves. We are not only talking about localizing, we're talking about also capturing the resources that are within the community itself. They made people, there are so many. So if we are able to utilize social media and other things to showcase the initiative, it draws the attention of those that are from there that could be able to support. There are also smaller little businesses in the community. There are, that could be mobilized to be able to be part of the solution that someone came and inspired, but really wanting to anchor it and make sure that it stays like that when they leave and inspire to another area. So for me, it's very important. Like I spoke about the issue of social cohesion, people starting to know one another in these areas and really noticing, the resources that they have within themselves, and then having money now starting to circulate within these communities, really a couple of times before it can leave to go to a Pick and Pay or to go to a big retailer or a macro or things like that. And I'm not saying that we can get it right in the beginning, but I think when people are able to see something great being done by one of them in the community, they feel proud and they want to be part of it. And I was like, wow, I don't know, who are you? This guy is so-and-so, he says, yeah, but I don't know his name. I know him, he's from the street. I left my place a couple of years ago, but I want to buy these boxes for each and every one on my street. And it was so humbling to be able to go there, this young man taking the box, so-and-so from house number what has bought this food for you guys. And they can put a name to a face. And what a prideful moment, even in the midst of Corona. I called it, I said, love in times of coronavirus. It's having communities realizing their own potential, because it comes from there, realizing that we don't need someone to come in and tell us that we are worthy and we've got these resources. It's knowing that we have what it takes. Even the people who don't have money, they've got hands, they get strength, they can pick up things, they can deliver. So everybody in that way will feel that they are part of this thing that is emerging. And that's when they can start wanting to be curious about how can we be part of this food system that has been set up or revived in our area. What is it that I can start selling? Maybe I can start selling compost to the farmers, or I've got a bakkie that I'm not using. I can use it as deliveries of these things and get paid something at the end. So I think for me, it has been a very humbling thing. And I think if we can be able to take this really and see how we can build on this, really learn from this experience and see how we could inspire many more communities to go like this. Because I think it was a huge, giant leap of faith. Out of desperation, we had to come up with all sorts of things that have been spoken here. And I think it's important that we build on them, we strengthen them, we dialogue about them, improve where necessary, take out what didn't work, because a lot of it didn't work, because it was just an impulse, coming in, but we can be able to take what we believe can be able to help us create this alternative food systems, that, really define the food economy that we believe is appropriate for our people.
Thank you. Susanna, around the role of citizens and communities?
Thanks, Vish. I think that I just want to pick up exactly where Gloria left off, which is about local supply and local spend and circulating that money within the economy. A tanker goes past. Even scaling that out to city level. We've been trying to make this point about local food supply for 10 years with the PHA being a peri-urban farmland. And this is what we're going to have to do in towns across the country, is to make sure that the peri-urban farmlands don't get paved over and they're preserved to provide food and provide jobs. And this is really has to be central to the work that we do in future, is that farmlands and arable land, this country only has 12% of it is arable. So where there is a water supply, there was a water supply question. The PHA is fortunate in that it has an aquifer directly beneath it. But ironically, the families to whom we are giving food only have a drip supply of municipal water. In a lot of the places, you'll have 40 families on 3 taps, which are on a drip supply. And so the question of rethinking the structures and how to then do it either on a city scale where you magnify up to a metro level, or just on a town by town by town by town multiplication factor, you're going to do really well if you concentrate on the local farmlands, because Gauteng is doing pretty well in that regard, and it's pretty well mapped. We now need to map it in the other provinces, use the same methodology that's had it mapped, and promote support of small-scale farming in peri-urban farming areas. And a document that went out yesterday speaks exactly to the fact that the Department of Agriculture concentrates on giant commercial farmers, and that's not going to feed us. The other element I just wanted to quickly refer to is that within the survey that we put out, we're asking what's the water supply, and we're also asking what's your cooking, are you on fuel, are you on gas, are you on paraffin, are you using a fire? So you can't address the problem if you don't know how big the problem is. So those are the questions, some of the questions we're asking. With regard to the fresh food, we're putting out 25 kilograms of food, and a third of it is fresh vegetables. We're lucky we're in the farmlands. We can provide a third of that pack as fresh veggies. It's going out with recipes as well. I think there's going to be a big shift across to a more vegetarian way of eating, because we're able to provide lentils and beans and speckled beans and split peas. So we had the chef who put together the box living off that food for a week. And she actually fed everybody on R8.50 a day. Wow. So everybody in her family ate for a week, and the cost per day was 34 Rand. And wow. I think that if we have a little bit more action in that regard, and to take away this factor of, are you a carnivore or are you a vegetarian, and actually switch to a food supply that switch to food habits that match the local food supply, then we'll be on our way. That'll make a big difference. And then lastly, I just want to say that when the seeds were locked up, I told everybody to rather go and plant up their spice cupboard. It's full of fenugreek and mustard and all sorts of things that you can plant and grow greens for yourself. And that's a little bit of the thinking. You don't have to have a giant vegetable garden to provide yourself with food. There are different ways to do it, and all of this new thinking is going to be so valuable. Let's not let a good crisis go to waste. If our own chef can partner with a couple of her other chefs and work out what's local and what's edible, we are putting flour into our food pack because a lot of pot bread is cooked in the local house in the houses. And it's been very interesting. She's been generating foods from Mozambique across to Angola and traditional foods out of Windhoek just from her chef's network. She works for one of the big restaurants. And so from the chef's network of guys who are staying at home, they've been able to give her recipes to cook out of that food pack. And this reconfiguration away from fast food is fantastic. It's a mercy. It's a godsend. So we can take advantage of this well.
Thank you. Tatjana, do you have any thoughts on the role of citizens and communities and whoever lives in South Africa, actually? Yeah.
I think, Vish, what we've seen here is, and you know, the risk of sounding like a hashtag, but is, you know, the people power, collaboration matters. I mean, living in Cape Town, the work of the community action networks has been extraordinary. And there's so many stories of, you know, everybody here, I'm sure everybody listening has 10 stories to share just from today of the actions being taken at a individual level. And I think what's important to surface out of that is that there's really good evidence that with Susanna's thing, and thank you, I learned a lot, and I'm going to plant my fenugreek, and it's amazing. One of the things you learn in lockdown, you know, like how much you can make do with. And I think it is something important for us to realize as well. I mean, for those of us who are really the privileged few, we're learning a lot about what it is, what's important, and how much we have. And the evidence suggests that there's almost always a new social awareness arises out of a crisis. And there is no way, there is no South African who's going to go back to being able to live in ignorance about how the majority of South Africans live. There is no way, and that the same goes to government. I was on a conversation with a fairly high level government official the other day who said, we are learning that we are not a pro-poor government, and we always thought we were, and now we have to face up to the fact that we're not. And I think that learning at an individual level is surely going to bring us out into a different world, and it's coming from taking action as an individual. You can just obviously pad yourself away in some little castle, but if you're part of the massive groundswell, which has been one of the most notable things coming out of this crisis, and I think WhatsApp is the defining technology of this crisis, you know, has allowed us, has allowed no one to remain ignorant and no one to remain passive.
Thank you. So this idea of human solidarity runs through everything all of you have been saying, you know, sort of what love in the time of COVID-19, to use Dorah's language, where people are willing to find it in their hearts, in their conscience, in their being, to want to share and want to give and so on. And that's a very important place to start. Now I want to open this up. Now, you know, I'm on a learning curve here too. Besides WhatsApp, Zoom is also one of the defining technologies. So I'm opening it up to Q&A. So everybody who's on here, so let me see. Why is the Solidarity Fund not represented in this webinar? Shouldn't it be engaged to hear how it's perceived and suggestions being made in here? Does anybody want to respond to that? That's from Intakona Ingatane.
I think that's a question for you, Vish.
Well, I really think that what's coming out from here is very rich, and we are going to extract from this a set of demands, actually. I was going to say that in my concluding remarks. I mean, one of the demands is to transform the way the Solidarity Fund works. And that would include, I mean, the kind of food that it puts out, the sort of food parcel, the nutritional balance in that, the partnership with communities is very, very important. To really kind of think about this problem on scale, the issue of resourcing a whole set of networks out there. I think so there's a whole set of issues that have come out of this discussion that we'll flag on the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign, definitely after this. Are there any other questions? I've opened it up to Q&A from the audience. Maybe if I can pick up one or two of the other
There's
issues.
lots in the chat, huh?
Yeah, there's a lot
there's
in the
some
chat.
they're in the chat.
Can we make sure that the emergency groups that blossomed and responded continue afterwards? That's Sunny Boy Morgan. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Does anybody want to say something? I think there's a lot of organic grassroots impulse that's come to the fore, led from below. Leadership is coming from below. I mean, Susanna and Dorah and the work they're doing in the local spaces, I think, are demonstrating that. Does anybody else wants to say something about this? I mean, the crisis that is also alongside the COVID-19 crisis is the climate crisis, okay? If this pandemic hit us 2-3 years ago at the height of our drought, when big parts of our food system were collapsing, we would be in a worse place. We are going to heat more and we are going to become drier as a country. So how we do think about local action networks, building the next food system, the food sovereignty system, I think is important. Any thoughts about that? Around sustaining networks, building networks?
Yeah, definitely. I think from our work, we have already identified, the work that we'd like to do post this, which is, to continue with our mapping of who's in this group, in these communities, who are the small producers, what are they producing, bee farm, beekeepers, where are they, how many, and all of these things. And we really would like to inspire a solidarity market in each of the communities that we're working with. And the community can decide whether they would, that market would operate once a month or twice a month. And, they've already started talking about they would like to be able to collaborate with each other, the producers themselves, and to support one another. They've spoken about the work of Litsima, which they could do to rotate, amongst each other's places and to assist with planting with, those who've got pieces of land, obviously, but also the databases that we are creating in each community. We would like to continue working with those communities and looking at how they could be able to continue to support one another. But I think beyond that is the partnerships that have been that we have built in response to this. So working with the organizations that we wouldn't have thought of working with, now all of a sudden sitting and talking. And I think it's important that we realize, I think also with the climate struggle, that it needs everybody. It needs people who work in health, people who work in environment, people who are working in agriculture, for us to have a holistic response to the challenges that are manifesting, the climate crisis that is manifesting itself within many of these communities. And I think in the past, I come from the environmental movement. There's been a tendency to network with one another and not, go across the sectors of the other sectors like health, to be able to start building the bridge, so that our message can also start getting out and inspiring and informing the work that everybody's doing.
Before I bring in Tatjana and Susanna about, sustaining networks and so on, the one big shock that we've had as our society has been the drought. And it would seem that there's a particularity here around day zero in Cape Town. If you were to try to trace the development of these cans, did these cans emerge in the context of the drought, for example, and the networks that we are seeing emerging and so on? Because that was a big shock. And is there kind of continuity out of that into COVID-19? Or maybe the story is different. Tatjana, do you want to say something about that? I'll go on to Susanna.
So Susanna, you might know different, but my experience in day zero was not linked to the cans, although there is no doubt that the preparation that was forced upon provincial government, city officials and households pre-equipped Cape Town to be rapidly responsive. But whether that came down to the development of the CAN network, I would think not, certainly not in its very deep and wide form that it is in now.
Susanna?
Yeah, Tatjana, I'm not entirely sure that the government here is responsive, because they've just become more and more militarized. Their response seems to be that we have to order the people. and there's very little engagement with local networks. All they've done is repurpose businesses and turn them into NGOs so that they will be the emergency response. I know a few of the people who were the activists in the response to water are now very active in the cans. I wanted to say that the emergence of the cans has a similar parallel in our area and in the townships, where I think people just needed courage to realize that they can organize for themselves. The other element, of course, Vish, is that with everybody under lockdown, now people have a bit more time. Because really, you can't organize politically when you are spending 2 hours driving to work and 2 hours coming home and trying to provide for your family on living on the breadline. So it's a fascinating moment in time. I do think that these networks are going to carry on forwards. I think that the people who have the resources to go and look for money and that sort of thing, that's what the cans are doing. The people who have the ability to speak to each other and set themselves up to be on the receiving end of this emergency, of this crisis element, are very organized. And in future, that sort of organizational structure is going to serve communities very well in the long run. You know, the street committees of yore. I think we have to go back to that sort of that approach to organizing, and because this has got off the ground, it's fantastic that it has. There was a question earlier about energy. We did put the energy question into our survey. What we're doing is reminding people not only of their grandparents' eating habits, but ironically, again, one of the elements that the chef brought up was that she cooked most of her food in the hot box. So she cooked everything for 10 minutes in the morning and put it in the hot box for the day and came out at night with the fully cooked dinner. And so that's the sort of thing that we're going back to. So when I'm speaking to people, when we're handing out the food packs, people are realizing that actually we've forgotten what our grannies used to do to get the food cooked and that sort of thing. So the advantage now is that we are talking about food, but we are specifically talking about energy, because people simply don't have enough money. So if you're boiling up your pot on a fire, which most people are resorting to now because they don't have gas and they can't afford paraffin, if you're cooking up on the pot on the fire, we're reminding people that you can wrap that pot in a blanket, gooi in a box for the day, and that'll be your supper at night. So we're very excited about that element as well. Yeah.
There's a comment here and a question. Sandy Williams, Aunties in Mitchell's Plain. She makes a very good point. People couldn't join because of digital cost, etc. But she raised a very important issue about community kitchens. Are there any experiences about community kitchens, communal kitchens that are emerging anywhere that people can talk to? Does anybody know about that? Okay.
I think
there is one that has been set up in Bertram's in the Victoria Yard. Just the lady just before we came onto this call. It is part of a COVID-19 response group within that whole area in the Makers Valley. So I think it's amazing, because I immediately thought, there are a whole lot of people who are sitting at home, and it would be brilliant to get together, to cook together, for their own families, but also to serve the other, to serve people in their own community, and also an opportunity for the young people to come and learn a new skill that they could, after the COVID-19, say, I know how to prepare meals, I know how to serve, you know what I'm saying? Like, really let's look at the opportunities in all of these responses that could assist us with the challenges that are already there.
Okay. Tatjana, did you have anything to say about this?
Yeah, there obviously were some pre-existing this, and it's been quite an important food security response in rural agricultural towns, where excess food from farms is taken in by church communities and others for community kitchens and for feeding the vulnerable and particularly children. So those sort of things remain a very active solution, particularly outside. I mean, I'm sure they exist in the big metros as well, but in the smaller towns, they're crucial.
Before I bring you in, Susanna, I just want to add another question. Sydney Church How do you go about finding sustainable, cheaper food sources if you're involved in providing food parcels at the moment? At the moment, the can group I am in are relying on supermarkets and wouldn't know how to find a sustainable source. So if you could also respond to that, Susanna.
Well, Vish, everybody says money makes you happy, but I haven't been so exhausted as I have the last 2 weeks of trying to spend 300,000 Rand on food and spend it the most as efficiently as I can. There are warehouses. There's usually a warehouse area in every city. So the area is Epping in Cape Town. What we usually do is for one shop, we'll send 3 of us to the 3 different warehouses, take all the prices, and then each person gets their shopping list, and then I'll run from one to the other and pay for the groceries. So the cans, I'm not sure. You see, we have it a little bit easy, Vish, because we are an essential service as a farm and as a packing farm. So we're able to have the labor, we're able to host the volunteers and do it all legally. And we are also certified in terms of handling food. So we're okay with that. I know various members of the cans are really frustrated because they can't get out and go and shop. And they are relying on this element of supermarkets providing the food and people donating food from supermarkets. And that really worries me because actually then you're getting far less food for the money that's being spent. And I think that we need to refine our approach to supermarkets to say that you need to give us a food pack that people can buy, and then organizations like myself can go and pick it up. And we want the contents to be XYZ. So give us the contents XYZ packed in a bag. Everybody who goes shopping there can buy that cost price pack, and then organizations can go and pick up those food packs if that's the way that it works. But getting bang for your buck is pretty difficult at this time. I don't know what the solution is. Maybe we should have a meeting and a webinar on that with people with more experience. Fortunately, the chairman of the campaign used to be a retailer himself, so he's very familiar with the whole gig. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Susanna, I don't know if this is still in play, but certainly about a week or 2 ago, in response to a question from Vish, I reached out to Massmart, who said that they were willing, Macro would be willing to engage with NGOs to give them a best price package. So they would provide, and believe you me, I am not a spokesperson for these initiatives, so I'm only putting it out there, and it's worth people knocking on their doors and asking them to make good on that commitment to provide a cut-priced package in staple goods needed for donations.
Thanks for that, Tatjana. When we're on the ground at Macro, they've been absolutely vehement that they're not giving discounts. So we've ended up shifting away a little bit from Macro. One of the other warehouses that we've been buying from is providing a food pack, but we took it and we analyzed it, and actually out of a 200 Rand food pack, only 79 Rand of that was nutritious. The rest of it was jam, sugar, cool drink, lemon creams. And I have a feeling that is like a Christmas pack. That's a Christmas pack. So that's their standard thing. Nobody's really thought about the nutrition. But then the cans are buying that in bulk because they're delivering that 200 Rand food pack somewhere. So it does require a little bit more awareness on the part of the cans. They need to look at the contents of what they are buying. I should think that the PHA campaign can undertake to make available the contents of our food pack and the logic behind the contents, and perhaps use that as something of a model that we would be able to present the supermarkets with when we're talking about a basic food pack. If they say we're prepared to hold a 200 Rand basic food pack, we didn't opt for that because then you have to make too many home visits. We wanted to feed people for a week to 10 days. But if the supermarket says we're prepared to let people buy 300 Rands worth of cost price stuff, we'd be happy to let our chef and their nutritionists put together a 300 Rand best spend. The trouble is things like lentils and that sort of thing. I know that the soya mince is pretty much gone from the shelves. So now we're opting for tins of baked beans. The beans and the kidney beans are going as well. The more processed it is, the easiest it is for people who don't have a proper cooking sauce. But of course, the more processed it is, the more expensive per gram of protein that you're providing.
Okay, I'm gonna wrap this up with a few concluding points. And the discussion has been very, very rich. So a big thank you to all our panelists, and also a big thank you to the participants. I mean, there's just been such a wonderful stream of comments, ideas, engagements, and I think this conversation should certainly continue beyond this particular platform. But I think the first point to kind of sort of hone in on is that the food crisis is a big crisis that we are facing right now. You know, one number that I threw into the conversation was about 30 million people in a state of food stress right now in the country. And this is a condition that can feed into all kinds of dynamics in our country right now. We are seeing the looting of supermarkets in some places, etc. So it's not in anybody's interests for us not to tackle this problem. And it requires everybody that has a commitment to food issues, food politics, and ultimately society to grapple with this issue. When it comes to the state's response, it's wholly inadequate and it is riddled with a whole set of problems. I mean, the Solidarity Fund, from what we've heard from you, is really not hitting the ground. It's not making that difference. It's not sort of blunting the edge at all. And from the standpoint of the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign, I think there are a couple of takeaways that we will want to message out of this. As I said, the one is the funding has to be democratized. That whole process has to be democratized. There has to be support given to a whole set of networks on the ground right now. There has to be partnership with communities. This will enable things to move more rapidly, fast, and obviously sequentially, because this is an ongoing challenge that we're going to have probably for as long as this pandemic. We're going to have to think about the nutritional input into immediate relief, food parcels, etc. We really need balanced diets to be achieved in the midst of all of this. And I think what Susanna and them have done is a great example of this. I think the other point to make is that we cannot let the supermarkets off the hook. They are making lots of money in the context of this crisis. And I really do think that we have to reiterate our demands for ethical pricing, for them to, if you like, align with the public interest at this moment of crisis. We have to stress that they have a role to play also around solidarity buying. I mean, yes, the middle classes go and shop. Some sections of the middle working classes go and shop in supermarkets. But we've got to create the conditions for people to take their conscience, their activism into that space. There's the issue of involving the military and the police, etc., in distribution, not just for supermarkets, but also for the Solidarity Fund. We don't want a militarized approach to this situation. We want a human rights-based approach. We want a democratic approach. And we want to reaffirm the constitutional role of all these institutions in our democracy. I think the other very important point that has come up is that there are important breakthroughs that are being made on the ground by small-scale farming networks that were there before this crisis. There are great examples, points of reference, PHA being one of them, Gender CC's work being the other. There are numerous examples across the country. And I think this is where people need to be talking to each other. And we will be affirming in our call as the Food Sovereignty Campaign that the food commons has to be unlocked. Small-scale farmers, gardeners, local community kitchens, communal kitchens, food feeding schemes, all of these things have to be unlocked right now. Small-scale fishers have to be given rights again to also feed their families and their communities. So we'll be iterating that demand very, very strongly coming out of this engagement. So the food commons, if you like, has to be brought back. This relates to the other big question about the role of citizens, the next food economy, advancing food sovereignty pathways from below. We've just started engaging on that issue. And what we decided actually a week ago is that we're going to have another dedicated webinar on food sovereignty and agroecology and building pathways from below, We're going to try and invite in sort of the leading practitioners. Some of you are already on this panel, but there's a whole lot of others out there to come and share their experience. We want that to be a big webinar. Let's try, I mean, you know, we're paying for these packages. I know there's a data problem, etc. But if people can communally get resources and plug in solidarity, there'll be a lot of learning that will happen around that webinar. The final point to make is that, and to conclude, is that there's definitely an imperative for solidarity at this point in time, and together we can overcome. So I want to end it on that note. This has been recorded. It'll be available to people. Once again, thank you to all participants. Thank you to our panel, and please stay safe. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.